Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
A new executive order makes fixed-price performance-based contracts the default across the federal government, requiring extra justification and senior approval when agencies want to do something different. Joining me to walk through how that shift could reshape how contracting officers plan, justify, and manage major programs is Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting, Emily Murphy. Emily, thanks for joining me today.
It's wonderful to be with you, Terry.
I'm so grateful that you're on a regular cadence because every time we get you on the show, there's a new executive order to talk about. There's a new one out April 30th. Let's talk about that one.
There is, and it's interesting. As you know, I do some work with the Baroni Center, and one of the very first papers I wrote for the Naval Postgraduate School years ago was on the increase in executive orders in government contracting. And it was looking at the Clinton administration, George W. Bush, Obama administration, the very first Trump administration, and the beginning of the Biden administration. I don't know if I should be thrilled that everyone has discovered government contracting and how wonderful it is, or just surprised that there are so many executive orders you can write on government contracting.
Well, this one is out now pushing hard for firm fixed price contracts. What is behind this administration's new EO? I mean, they've been pushing in this direction for a while. Why did we need a new EO to continue the argument?
It's an interesting question because the preference for firm fixed price contracting goes back to 1994 in the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act. Performance-based contracting, it goes back to the fiscal year 2001 NDAA, where we required performance-based for services. So the underlying policy here is a long-established, good government contracting policy. The question then really becomes, why do we need, what hasn't taken? I think that Jason Miller wrote an article that explored that even though this is the preference, it hasn't been as widely adapted as the administration wants it to. So this is another attempt to say, okay, what do we need to do to really reinforce this? And it follows essentially on even the FAR deviations from the Revolutionary FAR overhaul. Also reinforced this preference for firm fixed price and performance-based contracting.
This EO adds a new approval layer, requires agency head approval for cost reimbursement or other non-fixed price contracts. How is that going to change the day-to-day behavior of the contracting offices?
So I think that the first thing it'll do is it will make contracting officers reluctant to, or more reluctant to, use something other than a firm fixed price contract unless absolutely necessary. I don't think it's going to lead to unbundling of contracts or breaking requirements apart because, frankly, I don't think we've got the workforce to do that. So I think that this will indeed promote the use of firm fixed price contracts. But it's also going to slow down contracting. So for those cases where something other than firm fixed price is appropriate, and I don't mean there are exceptions in there, obviously, for R&D, it is going to require that it has to go up to the head of the agency. And in the case of an assisted acquisition, it suggests that it may even need to go to both agencies for review. So that really could slow things down. It could also change the incentive to use an assisted acquisition agency if you're going to need multiple levels of review.
So there seem to be folks who are on the pro side that this is good, as you say, for accountability and cost discipline. There are folks who say, but this is going to make it harder and slower. How does the administration balance that tension?
I think it's really about risk shifting. And so if you go back to the initial premise behind firm fixed price contracts, the idea was, when appropriate, the private sector, by setting a firm fixed price, is going to have the incentive to keep the price down because they're going to want to compete and win the work. But they're also not going to want to make it unreasonably low because they're going to want to be able to cover their costs and have a profit. And then we've sort of said at that point in time, we're not going to ask them what their profit is. We're going to let them have the profit they deem that they can build into it and still win and still be the lowest, still be the best value for the government. Whereas in cost reimbursement, the government's bearing that risk. Every time that there's an additional cost or a change, the risk is borne by the government. The challenge we're going to see in this, though, is if things that wouldn't have previously lent themselves to being firm fixed price are put into that bucket, are we going to have more modifications to contracts? Are we going to have repricing of contracts? Are we going to see this coming in later? And so how do you train contracting officers And how do you build the flexibility into those contracts so that we don't end up in a cycle where we're having to come back and revisit the same requirements again and again to build in that flexibility that we were trying to get by making it firm fixed price.
Emily Murphy is Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and former GSA Administrator. Emily, when I think about firm fixed price contracts, I think it works great when I know exactly what I want to buy. But when you think about really big, complex acquisition projects, we may not know exactly what we want. There may be some experimentation. Requirements may shift. How does this new rule, if we can call it that, I know it's not formal, but new guidance, how's that going to shift how agencies do requirements determination?
I think it's going to require that they look at not just the immediate requirement, but the evolution of it. So it could lead to better acquisition planning so that we're actually thinking about how a contract, how a purchase is going to evolve over time. However, the challenge is that we're not prescient. And so the contracting officers, the programs, those who are coming up with the acquisition plans, developing the requirements, aren't always aware of what's going to happen either on a global scale, on a national scale, on a technological scale. How are things going to evolve over time? And requirements do evolve. That's why we've got modifications already, and the ability to be brought in there. It is going to be a question, though, of how do you price for that? How do you build that flexibility in? And are each of those going to, if there's a modification and it's $5 million, but the overall contract was $20 million originally, does this now put it above the threshold? Or does it require another level of review? So in some ways, it may give agency heads a better control over scope creep. And that could be a very positive thing. Or it could slow down day-to-day operations when a normal change happens that just was not calculated for. A lot of it's going to depend on what ends up happening with the actual FAR case.
You mentioned scope creep there. Do you feel like acquisition offices and agencies in general have the discipline to hold to a requirement that's put out in a firm fixed price contract as things change?
Well, do we always want them to? Do we want to continue to pay for a set of requirements that no longer meet our needs? Or is that the appropriate time for contracting officers to be working with their programs, to be working with agency leadership to say, look, we need to pivot and we need to adjust? And if this leads to that being a more transparent conversation about what that's going to cost and what the cost benefits on that might be, that could be a very positive outcome. One thing I do think is fascinating in the executive order is the requirement for the 90-day review for each agency of their 10 largest non-firm fixed price acquisitions, especially since it says that it applies not just to the contracts that they awarded for themselves, but also for contracts they awarded on behalf of others. So that's going to also require that GSA and others go back and look at contracts where they weren't the ones who developed the requirements. It's also going to be interesting to see how this ties into the reviews that are already taking place at the SPE level on the desire to do non-commercial solutions. So, how does that tie in with the prior executive order on that topic? And so how do we fit this all together so we make it a seamless work stream rather than a series of stops and starts?
That's a good question. And when you think about those 10 largest non-firm fixed price contracts, the executive order does still allow for cost reimbursement contracts in limited circumstances like research and development, for example. How are they going to balance where firm fixed price lands and where it's not appropriate?
And I think that we're going to have to look to both the training and the rulemaking to understand that. Now, R&D, I think we all, or most people would agree that R&D is very hard to do on a firm fixed price basis because in R&D, you're assuming that there are a bunch of unknowns, that you're going to be learning things as you go along, and that there are going to be starts and stops, there are going to be errors, there are going to be new discoveries, there may be dead ends. So in that, if we go back to that risk shifting calculus, it's more appropriate that the risk be borne on both sides because you're going to want each set to be both the contractor and the government to be very involved in managing those costs. And that's why we cap the profit on those contracts also. Whereas with a commercial type procurement, if you're just buying a product, there's really not much risk. And so the firm fixed price model makes sense. When we get into services is where it gets much more difficult. And this also seems to fit into the discussions that we've seen about how do we want system integrators to work? How do we want consulting contracts to work? How do those fit into the federal ecosystem? And what's the appropriate role for those entities to be playing?
So what's the next step here? How does this get from executive order into the FAR?
So there are, first we've got the 90-day review with data going back to OMB on contracts. We also have a fairly aggressive timeline for a draft FAR case and starting that rulemaking process. It'll be interesting to see if that's integrated into the RFO rulemaking process or if it's done as a separate process. And then we've got the requirements that both the Federal Acquisition Institute and the Defense Acquisition University have to develop training on how to implement this. So we've got, this isn't going to be the light bulb goes on tomorrow, but it is very much going to be a change in the process for what we're already in the outlier contracts. A lot of work is currently being done firm fixed price. It's going after those that are not, that could appropriately be put into that bucket.
Emily Murphy is Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and former GSA Administrator. Emily, thanks for joining me, and we'll look forward to next time when there might be a new executive order to discuss.
Thank you, Terry. Great being with you again.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.